So, hi everyone. I just wanted to welcome everyone this afternoon. Thank you for coming to learn how to communicate your research with confidence and clarity. I'm going to shortly hand it over to Dr. Ross over here, who will introduce themselves and show you the presentation. Please know that you can ask at any time, any questions, put them in the chat box, but we'll leave plenty of time, at least 15 minutes at the very end, to answer any of your questions about communicating your research effectively and doing it with, again, confidence and clarity. So with that being said, Dr. Ross, Andy, happy to hand it off to you. And then I'll be here fielding any questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Roshni, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm delighted to get the chance to spend some time talking with you and learning from you. And I thought by way of introduction, I would share that I'm a senior lecturer here in the Whiting School of Engineering, but my background is in the humanities, in English. So I'm sort of an English major among the engineers, and I've made it my professional mission to help people communicate with clarity and confidence and to make something like public speaking actually a lot of fun instead of something we dread. So today I'm hoping we'll be interactive and you'll feel comfortable, turning on your camera or turning off your mute and sharing or putting something in the chat. I'm going to share some slides and begin. By way of introduction, I got thinking recently about superpowers. And if I could pick any superpower, what would it be? Maybe you've thought along these lines in the past before. But a friend of mine recently said their favorite version of this question is not a superpower like being able to fly or be invisible, but it's like an everyday superpower, like being able to fold a fitted sheet on the first try. Or every time you pull up to a red light, it automatically turns green. So in the chat, what would be your everyday superpower? Maybe it's something as simple as being able to, I don't know, like communicate your research. Maybe it's something like you want to be able to always be the only person on the elevator when it arrives. For me, I think if I could pick any everyday superpower, I would say I want to be able to chop onions like those fancy chefs on TV do without having my eyes water. I love cooking. I love food. I love cuisines. So today I'm going to be talking a lot about food and using metaphors from food and cooking to describe some techniques for communicating research, hopefully in a way that will be useful to you. Natalie, I love your superpower, being able to make a recipe immediately with whatever food is available. That's awesome. All right, let's start here. Speaking of food and taste, why don't we savor public speaking? What do folks think? What about having to give a presentation can sometimes be unpleasant? Here's a moment where you can unmute if you'd like, or in the chat, you can. Yes. The feeling of vulnerability, of being suddenly open to criticism or judgment, that's not a particularly pleasant feeling. Or an anticipation of that moment when suddenly all eyes are on you and you need to perform something in a way that hopefully you've prepared for, but you're never quite sure. Will there be questions that pop up, like Victoria's saying? Will there be things that I didn't anticipate that maybe I should have? Or like Samina's mentioning in the chat, maybe the fear is like our point will be misunderstood, or we won't be clearly, I don't know, recognized for the value that we're trying to offer. I think there are lots of different ways that public speaking can be a little bit challenging and feels like eating your vegetables, something you have to do, but maybe you don't actually enjoy so much. my goal today is in the next half hour or so to try to give you some ways to change the flavor of communicating your research, to make it something not just palatable, but also delicious, something you really are looking forward to. A few years ago, I cleaned out my dad's house and found a box of old recipes. I don't know if any of you have this same box on top of the fridge collecting dust. But I got thinking about recipes and what a recipe represents. And I got thinking about my own recipe for a pitch, right? If I was going to give a 3-minute overview of my own research, what would I try to include in the recipe? So I would probably start with a tablespoon of a strong impression, something that catches people off guard and that helps them to pay attention and start to invest their interest in what I have to say. Then I would add 2 cups of clear and novel findings. And I would add them early in the process. Sometimes we feel like we have to wait until the end to reveal the big ta-da moment. The risk, of course, is that we've lost our audience's attention and they've drifted off to TikTok or something else. So I always try to front load my main point, the thing that I think is going to be most important early on. Next, I would add a 1/4 cup of a strong sense of purpose. And I would adjust that purpose to the audience and their taste. What are they looking for? Do they need expert level detail? Do they need a high level overview? I would try to refine my goal based around the audience, who's going to be listening. All right, next, a 1/2 cup of meta commentary, transitions, and those sauces that connect the whole dish and bring everything together. People want to see where we're going and how we're getting there when we present our research. A handful of examples or comparisons or some narrative elements always helps to help our audience connect and understand what we're trying to say. Today, we'll talk a little bit about visual aids. They can be helpful, but usually only helpful when they're well-designed and appropriate for the circumstance. And then the last thing is 2 tablespoons of a confident ending, a squeeze of lemon, a shake of salt at the end that kind of elevates the value of what we're trying to share. I'm going to break down a few of these elements. I don't have time to get into all of them, but I think combined together, they create a good experience for our audience. The best cooks, when they have a recipe, they do their mise en place. They kind of get everything chopped and set and ready before they begin to cook. And so I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about an experience I've had, and maybe some of you have had, when it comes to preparing not just a meal, but preparing a presentation. Let's say you have a speech or some other responsibility, and the first thing you do is avoid preparing it. You clean the whole house, the kitchen is spotless, you've gone and ran a marathon before you've had to actually sit down and prepare this presentation. When I was in grad school, I had a buddy who, before he started working on his dissertation, he literally built from scratch a desk at which he would sit to write his dissertation. And I guess that was probably important for his process, and he did eventually finish the dissertation, but it seemed like avoiding a little bit. Because we tend to avoid something we don't want to do, then when we actually have to do it, it's hard and we struggle, and that struggle makes us feel bad about ourselves and kind of amplifies those bad beliefs that tend to sneak in, like, oh, I'll never be a good communicator, or, oh, I always mess up when I have these types of presentations. And that erodes our confidence and makes it even harder for us to take on opportunities in the future. So this is a negative spiral that can become a feedback loop quickly that causes people to struggle. What's the resolution? What's the intervention? I think one of the big steps we can do is change the way that we prepare. If we improve our preparation, if we become kind of obsessive at the start, it can make the rest of the process all the more enjoyable. And if you are looking for some ways to improve your preparation, even before you have a full set of slides or even before you've had experience delivering your content, I encourage you to visit the new Hopkins Technical Communication Lab, which is a place where there are trained consultants like myself available to meet with anybody who would like about public speaking. You can come and share a rough draft of a pitch and get some feedback. You can come and bring a deck of slides and get some encouragement about visual design, but these appointments are entirely free. I've put the QR code to the website there, and there'll be a link later on in my slide deck for you to copy down if you'd like. Okay. One of the ways that we can best prepare is by defining the problem that our research addresses. And some ways to do that is to think about the origin story of the problem. Where does it start? Where does it come from? What is its cause? What key terms define the problem? As academics, we care about the language we use. We're invested in what definitions mean. And so I think even before we start to communicate our research, we should know what terms matter for us and why. Who's impacted by the issue? In other words, what are the stakes of this problem? Which is what I just said. So these are some questions we can ask ourselves as we're preparing and defining the main challenge that our research addresses. We might want to frame the challenge as an opportunity, though. We might want to say there's some benefit for our discipline, for our community, if we address this issue. I brought an example of a speaker defining a technical problem. And we're just going to watch, this is a TED Talk by Nikolai Begg. We're just going to watch maybe 2.5 minutes of it. And I want you at the start to pay attention to how does this presenter define the problem their research addresses.
The first time I stood in the operating room and watched a real surgery, I had no idea what to expect. I was a college student in engineering. I thought it was going to be like on TV. Ominous music playing in the background, beads of sweat pouring down the surgeon's face. But it wasn't like that at all. There was music playing on this day. I think it was Madonna's Greatest Hits. And there was plenty of conversation, not just about the patient's heart rate, but about sports and weekend plans. And since then, the more surgeries I watched, the more I realized this is how it is. In some weird way, it's just another day at the office. But every so often, the music gets turned down, everyone stops talking, and stares at exactly the same thing. And that's when you know that something absolutely critical and dangerous is happening. The first time I saw that, I was watching a type of surgery called laparoscopic surgery. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, laparoscopic surgery, instead of the large open incision you might be used to with surgery, a laparoscopic surgery is where the surgeon creates these 3 or more small incisions in the patient, and then inserts these long, thin instruments and a camera, and actually does the procedure inside the patient. Now this is great because there's much less risk of infection, much less pain, shorter recovery time, but there is a trade-off. Because these incisions are created with a long, pointed device called a trocar. And the way the surgeon uses this device is that he takes it and he presses it into the abdomen until it punctures through. And now the reason why everyone in the operating room was staring at that device on that day was because he had to be absolutely careful not to plunge it through and puncture it into the organs and blood vessels below. But this problem should seem pretty familiar to all of you because I'm pretty sure you've seen it somewhere else. Remember this? You knew that at any second that straw was going to plunge through, and you didn't know if it was going to go out the other side and straight into your hand or if you were going to get juice everywhere, but you were terrified, right? Every single time you did this, you experienced the same fundamental physics that I was watching in the operating room that day. And it turns out it really is a problem. In 2003, the FDA actually came out and said that trocar incisions might be the most dangerous step in minimally invasive surgery.
Okay. I think I'll stop it there. So what's the problem? There's a fundamental problem of physics that this researcher is trying to address in their work. How do they define the problem? It seems like there's a couple of different ways that Nikolai Begg has done this. Who's got a thought, either in the chat or you can unmute if you'd like. What's one of the means that he uses to articulate the challenge that his research addresses? Yeah, good. Using an example, right? The juice bag, the Capri Sun. I've never done laparoscopic surgery, and I certainly hope I never will have to, but I've had to put a straw into one of those Capri Suns, and so I kind of can understand the physics challenge there. Yeah, it's relatable. What's another way he uses to define the problem? One is that he starts with a story, right? He tells the experience of sitting in on a surgery and watching this moment where suddenly everybody needs to be calm and careful. The third means that he uses is right here, this slide in which he quotes the FDA. If we were to continue to watch, you would see some other credible sources that he brings forward alongside the FDA to describe this issue as significant, as worth addressing. I think our audience needs us to show why our research takes on a problem worth solving. In this case, it's a biomedical problem, but it doesn't have to be a technical problem, right? All areas, from social sciences, humanities to STEM fields, they all have challenges. It's the challenge of the field. It's maybe a text that's been misinterpreted. It's maybe a question that's been overlooked. It's maybe a political issue that's been poorly addressed. We can think about all sorts of different problems, but putting the problem first can help once we start to think about who's going to be listening to us. So when we ask ourselves who's at the table, we want to think about what does our audience care most and least about? Is there something that they're here to understand? What do they want from me? What problems do they want solved, and where do they maybe have an advantage that I should be aware of and plan accordingly? I think once we've addressed our content, then we can start thinking about how to shape the content for the people that we're communicating to. And a big part of that is what I call finding the core. The core of your research is an accurate view of the context.
Done with meeting?
No, I didn't even start.
Oh, you have it like
3:30. Yeah, 10 minutes.
Our audience probably wants to know what's in the background. What are the issues that are sort of giving rise to our work? Next, they want to know what opportunity or problem we are addressing. And how? What's the response that we propose, right? Maybe it's because a certain way of reading 1980s crime novels has gone overlooked. I'm going to invest in that way of reading. Or maybe it's because there's some sort of public health issue that has not been sufficiently rectified. I'm going to take a particular response that will hopefully do just that. And then lastly, the effect of that response. What's the benefit? What's the value? In a minute, I might ask you to reflect on the core of your research and to think about these 4 elements, how they play out in your work. Here's a quick 3-minute example of somebody using all of the core principles at once. They have a slide, but what I like about this video is that we don't see their slide at all. And I want you just to pay attention to what this presenter says and how they give kind of a distilled version of the background, opportunity, response, and
Mosquito-borne
impact
disease is
of
Ross
that
River
research.
virus. I came to Australia to study the deadliest animal in the world. Now, there may be some Australian audience members thinking, Struth, science has finally recognized the importance of the drop bears. But I'm not studying drop bears, because around the world, by transmitting diseases like malaria and dengue fever, mosquitoes kill more than 1 million people every year, making them the deadliest animal on the planet. Now, in Australia, the most common mosquito-borne disease is Ross River virus, and it occurs at high rates in some areas, but not others. My question is why? What is it about certain areas that makes them breed disease? If we can understand the environmental factors that contribute to disease transmission, then we can alter the environment or target our control efforts to prevent human infections. But to answer that question, I had to find out where the infected mosquitoes were in South Australia. And traditionally, testing mosquitoes for virus has always been difficult. So I used a new technique. It takes these cards, which are embedded with virus-preserving chemicals, and coats them in honey. Mosquitoes will come to feed on the honey, and in the process, spit virus onto the card where it can later be detected. Now, no one had ever used this technique in a broad-scale virus survey before, so I had to adapt it. I developed new traps and set them at over 100 field sites across South Australia. Then I captured over 20,000 hungry mosquitoes and let them feed on the card for a week before testing the cards for virus. Now, you may not think that these traps look very impressive, but science doesn't have to be beautiful. It has to be effective, and these traps are proving to be our most sensitive method of detecting infected mosquitoes. I found 3 types of infection: Ross River virus, Barmah forest virus, and Stratford virus, which has never before been found in South Australia. I now have the virus data I need to conduct my analysis, and I'm collecting publicly available data about the environment surrounding my traps, like the density of human housing, the biodiversity of mammals, and the ratio of green space to buildings, to see if any of those environmental factors can link these virus hotspots that I've shown here. But the most exciting part of my research so far has been the success of this method. Public health officials in Victoria, Queensland, and Western Australia have been in contact with us about implementing this technique for their surveillance next year. And I developed these traps on a tight budget. I used recycled milk cartons, pantyhose, and paper clips to make the traps. Each trap costs less than $1 and can be reused for the whole season. That was important to me because the majority of mosquito-borne disease risk happens in economically impoverished countries. In India, for example, where about 1/4 of the population lives on $1 a day, there are 33 million cases of dengue infection every year. With my low-budget virus surveillance and spatial analysis method, I can help any country, regardless of resources, find out where their deadliest animals occur, why they're there, and how we can stop them from infecting humans. Thanks.
All right, so I think a pretty good distillation of a research project that hits those 4 core principles. There's context. We got a little bit of background about mosquitoes, the problems that they tend to spread. The opportunity is to figure out where disease is spreading and if there's a way that we can intervene in those locations to hopefully prevent that spread. The response to that opportunity is designing these new cards that trap mosquitoes in a particularly useful way. And the effect is that those cards are very affordable. They can be used, at minimal cost in places to hopefully address serious public health challenges. Now, it's short. It's maybe not perfect in every way, but I think even as a non-expert, I can understand the basic message, the main objective of the talk. One thing I want to encourage you to think about is not just who is your audience, but what do they want? In my classes, we always talk about this acronym WIFI, and WIFI stands for What's in it for you. And this is sort of an offer to the audience, you here as the audience, something you're going to give them or something you're promising to them. I tried to do this at the start of the session when I said in the next half hour, I want to give you some techniques that will help make communicating your research a joy. Hopefully that maybe perked up your interest because it was clear what my objective or offer was. If you only have 3 minutes, you can still say, in the next 3 minutes, I want to give you 2 new ways to think about whatever topic might be. Okay, and be thinking about what your goals are. Are you trying to simplify something? Are you trying to theorize something? If you only have 5 minutes to express your research, maybe you can't give a full sense of all the concepts, but maybe you want to clarify something, or you want to cut straight to the chase and offer some recommendations. Maybe if you have longer, you're going to run through your whole analysis. But I think thinking about the verbs behind our communication really helps. What does communicating mean? It can take all different types of shapes. And I think depending on what our goal might be, we want to be really intuitive, or rather really intentional and clear about what we want to accomplish. One way that we can do that is providing the right amount of structure. I don't know if you've had the frustrating experience that I have of reading a bad recipe and trying to follow it and realizing suddenly, wait, I'm on step 8 and I was supposed to have been, letting the dough rise for 2 hours, and I've just stirred together something that is going to have to sit around now forever. The way that we communicate our research is giving a sense of how our concepts connect and build on each other. One traditional way of doing that is going from introduction to methods to results and discussion. This is the way that academics oftentimes communicate their research in written form. But when we're speaking to an audience, whether that's over dinner, at a networking event, or at the front of an auditorium, I think it's oftentimes better to think about your presentation as a story that you can tell. Just like every meal kind of has an experience, hopefully your explanation of your research also has a bit of a narrative quality to it. We oftentimes get trained to think about points, making a point, getting to the point, PowerPoints. But I actually think points are sort of overrated when we're trying to make something that's complicated meaningful. A much better version, I think, is narrative. Story is more emotionally engaging. It's more, relatable. It's more memorable and impactful. One of the reasons why is because all narratives have an arc. They have kind of a structure that takes the audience somewhere. And this arc or narrative structure can vary, but they almost always start by establishing conflict, some kind of problem that the character, the protagonist, encounters, and that conflict then gives the rest of the story structure. It gives direction. If a stranger walks into town, suddenly now the story needs to figure out who is this stranger. Or if a person needs to make a difficult decision, suddenly now the story is playing out the consequences of that decision. But a conflict is where it's sort of the catalyst for the rest of the story. You can start to map these story structures if you want. So this is a little bit nerdy, but if we were to think about a presentation or a narrative as having a beginning and an end, and then fluctuating between 2 poles on my y-axis, at the top is good fortune, and at the bottom is ill fortune, we can probably map some classic plots or story archetypes on these 2 axes. There's, of course, the rags to riches story, where we start in a bad state and wind up much better than where we started. Then some people love the opposite, where there's a fall from grace. We go from good fortune to ill fortune. This is maybe in a circumstance where you want to offer a warning of some kind. If your research has dire consequences, maybe you want to use this structure. Or there's something that we might call getting out of a hole, where we find ourselves sort of in good fortune and then have a terrible, tragedy of some kind that we have to dig ourselves out of. And the methods that you use to do that may be part of that rising action at the end. There's the Icarus story, where somebody flies too close to the sun, right? We were brought down, humbled from our pride. maybe your research has something of that same arc where something's tried and it doesn't actually work out. Or there's the Cinderella story, where somebody works their way up to good fortune and then is suddenly brought low when midnight strikes and they have to figure out a way to reunite with the happy ending of the story. I don't know, these are sort of cliched tropes that pop culture tends to absorb, but I want to invite you to think about what's going to be the story arc of your research. Where does the narrative start? What choices get made along the way, and how does it resolve? Along the way, as you're telling that story, I invite you to pay attention to things like detail, accuracy, clarity, and pace. There's a series of videos that I like from Bon Appetit magazine, which are sort of cooking tutorials where somebody's trying to follow an expert but can't actually see what they're doing. On the right is Carla Lally Music, who works for Bon Appetit magazine and is a trained chef. On the left is DeAndre Jordan, who is an NBA basketball player. And he's just listening to her describe the process for making a dish. In order for him to be able to follow her, she has to use accurate details. She has to be explicit, clear, and precise in what she's describing. And this is sort of a spoiler alert, but she's really good at this. And usually the people who are trying to follow her instructions do pretty well because she's really, really good at taking the novice's mindset and putting herself in the shoes of the person who's trying to understand what it is she's communicating. Okay, all good stories have characters. Ideally, characters that we invest in. In your case, your characters may not be people. They may be trocars, they may be mosquitoes, they may be musical notation. I don't know, it could be anything, inanimate or animate, but the characters have to do something. They have to face a conflict and then take action. I love when a researcher can make something that seems inert, even something like, I don't know, geology, and suddenly bring it to life to show that there's action that happens that we should understand and care about, and action that hopefully moves toward some kind of resolution. All right, I want to sort of finish up my presentation with a few words about slides. When we communicate research, we're oftentimes encouraged to use visuals. And I have always tried to emphasize that we miss out on a good opportunity when we think of the slides as the presentation. The slides are not the presentation. What you say or what I say is the presentation. The slides just amplify what I'm trying to say. They make it memorable. In making a film, even a film about cooking, they always storyboard, but the storyboard is not the final film, right? And so your slides can be like your storyboard. Maybe they're useful for structuring what kind of story you want to tell, but they're not the story. What you say is the story. And so I encourage you to think about how you can use slides not as a script or not as something that your audience has to, focus completely on, but as just the thing that adds that memorable element to your communication. Here's a slide that needs some help. We've all seen slides like this. It's a slide it's really a written document that's masquerading as a slide. It's a set of bullet points that the presenter will probably read from, and that the audience might try to read from, but will also be trying to listen to and will have a hard time focusing on. I think PowerPoint wants us to use these types of outline bullet points, things like this, where we have a set of topics and subtopics, and then there's an image kind of shoved off to the side. You don't know this about me because we're on Zoom, but I'm the exact size of a newborn giraffe. So the giraffe is my spirit animal and my favorite animal. And it's so beautiful, but here it's been sort of trapped in a sad box. I would rather liberate the giraffe and have it fill the full slide, and then balance it with some text that might be important, but that you're not going to read directly from. You're just going to let the audience kind of absorb on their own. We can also use slides to describe a process, but instead of doing it in a static way where people are overwhelmed with details, we can use slides to structure the process, to explain how something happens in time, or to click elements onto the screen one at a time so that we can explain them in order with a rhythm and pace that makes it easier for our audience to appreciate what it is we have to say. So to do that well, you have to practice and know which element is coming next, but it can be more helpful as a technique than just throwing a whole bunch of information on the slide all at once. Okay, to close, I want to reiterate my invitation to think about if you had 3 minutes to change the world with one idea, what would be the core of that one idea? You have to eliminate all the inessential. You have to set aside things that maybe you've encountered and that you feel strongly about, but that your audience won't really have a particularly strong use for. And you have to really be strategic about identifying the one thing, the one benefit, the one story that you want your research to articulate. I think it's a joy to try to figure that out. I can remember as a PhD student the many iterations of that story that I went through. Year 1, I thought my research was about one thing, and by year 3, I had realized I had a completely different core to my project. So if it changes for you, that's perfectly normal. You may find, in fact, every time you articulate your research, that core is a little bit different. It's, somehow clearer or brighter or more urgent. I encourage you to keep practicing. That's one of the best things to do if you want to improve as a communicator, is put yourself like this in circumstances where you can do it. Not just think and worry about it, but actually try. The first time you hear words coming out of your mouth, you'll learn a lot more than all those hours that you spend in your own head worrying about which one to use. That's it for me and my slides. We've got plenty of time, though, for me to answer any questions or for us to have a discussion about particular issues that you would like to think and learn about when it comes to communicating your research. Thank you for your attention and for your participation, and I wish you the best of luck.